Agbetowe vi zo avugbelo. Yo yo. Agbetoblibo zo avugbelo. Yo yo. Maintenant vibe vi zo avugbelo. Yo.
Foru be jojoa yeji komile. Mila no ejika 3 jours anepa. Mila ba continuer ke kaka ebe démission et la joke gba mila jole. Moi dit.
Il faut laisser elle doit venir, il va faire pour lui aussi ma foi, non, c'est quoi? C'est forcé, ça c'est pas une question de chrétien, mais je sais pas. Tu as fait pour toi, il faut laisser quitter. Un autre va venir, il va faire pour lui aussi.
Bon, s'il te plaît, libère le Togo. Le pays, c'est pas pour toi. C'est pas pour famille Nyasingbe. Laissez le pays. Nous les citoyens, on va diriger le pays.
Démocratie.
Streets as violent clashes broke out between protesters and the security forces in Togo. The skirmishes come amidst rising dissent by citizens over President and the recent amendments to the constitution that would keep him in power indefinitely. Plumes of black smoke could be seen blowing above the streets of the country's capital Lome as angry protesters burned tires and furniture used for makeshift barricades. Shops and businesses also remain closed as protesters blocked the main roads. The capital came under heavy police protection as angry protesters hurled projectiles at law enforcement. Further, citizens have called for the president to step down.
All we want is for Farouk Gnassingbé to step down. We'll keep protesting even after the 3 days until he finally leaves power.
Now, the protests have been called by the coalition of political groups called Hands Off My Constitution that call for unprecedented peaceful demonstrations and release of political prisoners, following the government's crackdown on protests earlier this month. The president has ruled the West African nation since 2005 following the death of his father. He was sworn in as the president of the Council of Ministers, making him eligible to be re-elected by the parliament indefinitely with no official term limits. Opposition parties have called the latest decision a constitutional coup.
Once a rare sight in Togo's capital Lomé, protests are becoming frequent. The government, led by Farouk Gnassingbé, banned them 3 years ago. He's ruled for 20 years. Recent constitutional changes allow him to stay in power for life. Demonstrators want him to go.
He should step aside and let someone else lead. You can't keep ruling us by force forever. Let someone else prove what they can do.
Demonstrators blocked roads all over the city and in several other towns after activists called for 3 days of peaceful protests starting on Thursday. The rising cost of living has also fueled discontent. Togo's the 10th poorest country in the world.
All we want is for Gnassingbé to step down. We'll keep protesting, even after 3 days, until he finally leaves power.
A crackdown by police and soldiers hasn't kept people off the streets. Amnesty International says dozens were arrested and many tortured following demonstrations 3 weeks ago. The government says it hasn't received any official complaints of torture. But it's something the regional bloc ECOWAS has frequently condemned Gnassingbé's government for. His rule followed that of his father, Gnassingbé Eyadema, who was in power for 38 years. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands forced from their homes during decades of crackdowns on dissent. Last month, a popular singer, Amron, called for people to mobilise against the government in a social media video. He was arrested the following day. After his release, 2 weeks later, he apologised to Gnassingbé and said he was seeking psychiatric treatment in hospital. That hasn't deterred the demonstrators.
Four, please set Togo free. This country doesn't belong to you or the Gnassingbé family. Just let go of the country.
The government said anyone spreading false information or causing disturbance will face the full force of the law. Activists have called for the protests to continue until Saturday. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera.
Don't miss out, get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.
Jino babalo, tavio be jolo. Jino babalo, bloody ichelo. Agbetowe viso a footballo, yo yo. On envie ba viso a footballo, yo yo. Agbetowe viso a footballo, yo yo. Agbetowe bozo a footballo, yo yo. Démocratie banyaya, démocratie banyaya, udoka mon la fioka, la fioka. Maïk bon vieux ma va et toi bloussé. Tout y nani au votoir, tout y nani pas toi. Tu vas blourer tout dôme. Ma joga le pleut tous les 7 amants. Tout y nani au votoir, le blou le bon vieux. Adino au babalo, tavio be jolo. 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 Brave vio ichelo. Tavio be jolo.
In other news that we're tracking, hundreds took to streets as violent clashes broke out between protesters and security forces in the West African nation of Togo. The skirmishes come amidst rising dissent by citizens over President Fauré's recent amendments to the constitution that would keep him in power indefinitely. Plumes of black smoke could be seen billowing above the streets of the country's capital, Lomé, as angry protesters burnt tires and furniture used for makeshift barricades. Shops and businesses also remained shut as protesters blocked the main roads in the capital city that came under heavy police protection as angry protesters hurled projectiles at law enforcement officers. Further, citizens have called for President to step down from his resignation.
All we want is for Faure Gnassingbé to step down. We'll keep protesting even after the 3 days until he finally leaves power.
The protests have been called by a coalition of political groups called Hands Off My Constitution that called for unprecedented peaceful demonstrations and release of political prisoners as well. In fact, following the government's crackdown on protests earlier this month, Faure has ruled the West African nation since 2005, following the death of his father in May this year. He was sworn in as a president of the Council of Ministers, making him eligible to be re-elected by the parliament indefinitely with no official term limits. Opposition parties have called the latest decision as a constitutional coup. And for more on this, our correspondent Louisa has sent us this ground report. Listen into this.
Clashes erupted Thursday between protesters and security forces in Togo. Like their counterparts in Kenya, hundreds of Togolese took to the streets demanding the resignation of President Faure Gnassingbé, whose family has ruled for nearly 6 decades. The protests, sparked by controversial constitutional changes that would extend Gnassingbé's group on power, saw demonstrators burning tires and setting up barricades. Police responded with tear gas, arresting many people in the opposition stronghold of Bay. Civil society groups and social media influencers had called for a 3-day protest from 26 to 28 June, highlighting various demands that must be met. Despite intimidation by militiamen and soldiers, the mobilization continues in Lomé. With tensions rising and more protests planned, Togo's political future hangs in the balance. From Lagos, Nigeria, Louisa Olani, we on World is One.
Démocratie banyaya, démocratie banyaya, udoka mon la fioka, la fioka. Maïk bon vieux ma va et toi bloussé. Tout y nani au votoir, tout y nani pas toi. Jova blue retudoma. Me joga le ple tout le setama. Tout ineni yo votwa. E blue le bon vieux. Ajino o babalo. Tavio be jolo. 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 Blood of you, cello. Tavio be jolo.